The morning fog clung to the rolling hills east of Paderborn like a wet shroud. Staff Sergeant Robert Early peered through his gunner's periscope, watching the mist begin to lift as the sun climbed higher on this first day of April, 1945. His M4A3 Sherman, mounting the newer 76-millimeter gun, sat hull down behind a slight ridge, its engine idling with that familiar diesel rumble that had become the soundtrack to his war. Early had been a gunner in 3rd Armored Division since the breakout from Normandy 9 months earlier. In that time, he'd learned that the 76-millimeter gun mounted in his turret was both a blessing and a burden. Better than the old 75, certainly, but still outmatched by nearly everything the Germans fielded. The standing order was simple and sobering. If you spot enemy armor, withdraw and call for tank destroyers. The Sherman wasn't built to hunt tigers. But this morning, withdrawal wasn't an option. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The radio crackled with the voice of Lieutenant Morrison, the platoon leader. German armor was advancing toward the crossroads at Etteln, location critical, defenders thin. 3rd Armored had been racing eastward for days, scattered across a 40-mile front, and there simply weren't enough tanks in any one place. Early's crew, along with 2 other Shermans, represented the only armor between the crossroads and a German counterattack that intelligence suggested might include tigers. Early had seen a tiger once before, near St. Lo the previous July. He remembered the sick feeling in his gut when that massive gray hull emerged from behind a Norman hedgerow, the long 88-millimeter gun traversing toward his position. His driver had thrown the Sherman into reverse so fast the engine nearly stalled. They'd backed 200 yards through an orchard before the tiger's first round screamed past, missing by mere feet. A tank destroyer with a 90-millimeter gun had taken care of the tiger an hour later. Early had been grateful he'd lived to see it. Now, as the fog continued to thin, Early caught movement through his periscope. Dark shapes, still indistinct, perhaps 2,000 yards distant across an open valley. He reached for the traverse control, rotating the turret slightly for a better angle, and felt his loader, Private First Class Angelo DiCenso, shift position behind him in the cramped fighting compartment. Movement, 11 o'clock, Early said into his microphone. Long range, can't identify yet. Commander Sergeant First Class James Holbrook was already standing in the turret hatch with binoculars raised. I see them, 4 vehicles, big, moving west toward the crossroads. Early's mouth went dry. Big meant tigers or panthers. Either way, it meant trouble. The American gunner adjusted his sight picture, working the hand crank to elevate the gun barrel slightly as he calculated range and deflection. 22 years old, raised on a dairy farm outside Madison, Wisconsin, Early had learned gunnery the hard way, through survival. The men who missed their first shot against German armor rarely got a chance to correct the error. By April of 1945, the American tank crews on the Western Front had developed a healthy respect bordering on dread for German armor. This respect had been purchased with burned-out Shermans and charred bodies from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. The Tiger I heavy tank, mounting its formidable 88-millimeter gun and wrapped in armor up to 110 millimeters thick on the mantlet, could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, distances at which the Sherman's return fire was nearly useless against the Tiger's frontal armor. The mathematics of tank combat were brutally simple. The Tiger's 88-millimeter gun, firing armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor of only 64 millimeters from well beyond effective Sherman engagement range. Meanwhile, the Sherman's 76mm gun, even firing its improved M62 armor-piercing round at 2,600 feet per second, could penetrate only 109 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards against a flat plate. The Tiger's frontal armor, angled and substantially thicker, was effectively immune to the 76mm gun except at ranges where the Sherman itself became hopelessly vulnerable. American tactical doctrine had adapted to this disparity. Tank versus tank engagements were to be avoided. Shermans were to provide infantry support, suppress anti-tank positions, and exploit breakthroughs. If enemy armor appeared, the Shermans withdrew while faster M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, or the heavier M36 tank destroyers, with their 90mm guns, moved forward to engage. This doctrine kept Sherman losses manageable, but it did something else too. It taught American tankers that they were outgunned, out-armored, and fundamentally inferior in any armor-on-armor duel. Early had absorbed this lesson thoroughly. He'd seen too many burning Shermans, their crews scrambling out through hatches, or, worse, not scrambling at all. The Sherman had earned grim nicknames. Tommy Cooker among the Germans, Ronson among some British crews, after the cigarette lighter that lights first time every time. The dark humor barely masked the terror, but the lesson came with an asterisk that few American tankers fully appreciated. The Tiger's invincibility was largely frontal. From the sides, the Tiger's armor thickness dropped to 82 millimeters, still substantial but no longer impenetrable. And from the rear, the Tiger was as vulnerable as any tank. The challenge was getting to those angles without being destroyed first. As the fog continued to dissipate, Early finally identified the lead vehicle through his periscope. The distinctive boxy superstructure, the interleaved road wheels, the long gun barrel, Tiger 1, no question. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Confirmed, Tiger," Holbrook said over the radio to Lieutenant Morrison. "4 of them, advancing in column toward Etteln. Request tank destroyer support." The response came back almost immediately, Morrison's voice tight with frustration. "Tank destroyers are committed 6 miles north. You're what we've got. Hold that position. Infantry depends on that crossroads." Early heard Holbrook swear softly, then key the microphone again. "Understood. We'll do what we can." The gunner recalculated the range. The Tigers had closed to perhaps 1,800 yards, maybe slightly less. They were moving in single file along a dirt road that skirted the valley floor, apparently unaware of the 3 Shermans positioned on the ridge. The lead Tigers commander stood in his cupola, binoculars raised, scanning the terrain ahead, but not apparently looking at the ridge to his left. 1,800 yards. Far beyond the range at which doctrine said the 76mm could reliably penetrate a Tiger, even from the side. The British firing tables Early had seen during a training session back in February suggested the 76mm could penetrate 82 millimeters of armor at 30 degrees at about 1,600 to 1,800 yards, theoretically. But those were laboratory conditions, perfect 90-degree impacts, quality ammunition, properly maintained guns. This was combat, with all its variables and chaos. "Range to lead vehicle, 1,800 yards, Early reported. "Lead Tiger is hull up, broadside to us. The others are still in the column behind him." The tactical situation crystallized with awful clarity. If the Shermans opened fire and missed, the Tigers would immediately spot them and return fire with devastating effect. The ridge provided some defilade, but the Tiger's 88mm guns could punch through the Sherman's turret armor at this range like it was paper. If the Shermans held fire, the Tigers would reach the crossroads unopposed and roll over the American infantry positions. If the Shermans tried to close the range, They'd be spotted and destroyed before getting within effective range. There was no good option. Holbrook made the decision. Early, you've got the best position on the lead Tiger. When he stops moving, take the shot. Aim for the center of the hull just below the turret ring. We get one chance at this. Roger, Early replied, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. His hands, though, were slick with sweat inside his gloves. DiCenzo, the loader, already had an armor-piercing round chambered. The M62 APC round weighed 15 pounds and contained a small, explosive filler designed to create additional damage after penetration. Early had fired hundreds of these rounds in training and scores in combat, but never at a target at this distant. Never at a Tiger. Never with so much riding on a single shot. The lead Tiger reached a slight rise in the road and paused. The commander was still scanning ahead with binoculars, looking west toward Ettlin. The tank sat perfectly broadside to Early's position, presenting its entire 82-millimeter thick side armor. "Target stopped," Early announced. "Range 1,800 yards." He made minute adjustments to his sight, compensating for the extreme range, for the slight crosswind he could see moving the grass in the valley, for the elevation difference between the ridge and the road. 1,800 yards. The ballistic tables said the M62 round would be traveling at approximately 1,800 feet per second when it reached the target, right at the threshold velocity needed to penetrate 82 millimeters of armor. Maybe, if everything went perfectly, if the armor quality was average, if the angle was right, if the round didn't tumble or yaw in flight. Early took a breath, held it, and made a final elevation correction. Through the gunner's sight, the Tiger's hull filled his field of view. He could see the individual track links, the hull access hatches, the distinctive Zimmerit anti-magnetic mine paste covering the armor. He placed his sight reticle on a point just below the turret ring, where the hull was vertical, where the armor would be perpendicular to his shot. "On target," Early said. "Fire when ready," Holbrook replied quietly. Early's finger tightened on the firing trigger. He'd learned to squeeze it smoothly, like a rifle trigger, to avoid jerking the gun off target. In the instant before he fired, he thought about the German crew inside that Tiger, 5 men who had no idea they were in a Sherman's sights, who believed themselves safe at this range, who were probably confident in their massive tank's superiority. The thought didn't make him hesitate. The 76-millimeter gun roared, the entire Sherman rocking back against its suspension. The gun breech slammed backward in recoil, and DiCenzo immediately pulled the spent casing free and slammed another round home. Through the clearing smoke, Early tried to track his tracer, but at this range he lost sight of it almost immediately. The seconds stretched. At 1,800 yards, the round would take nearly 2 seconds to reach the target, an eternity in combat. Early watched through his periscope, waiting for the impact, expecting to see his round spark harmlessly off the Tiger's armor, or worse, miss entirely. Then the Tiger's side erupted. The impact was just below the turret ring, exactly where Early had aimed. For a fraction of a second, he saw the bright flash of metal on metal, and then the flash was overwhelmed by a larger explosion from inside the hull. Smoke began pouring from the Tiger's engine deck. "Hit!" Holbrook shouted. "You got a penetration." Early could hardly believe what he was seeing. The Tiger lurched to a stop, smoke now billowing from multiple hatches. The commander dropped into the turret and disappeared. Seconds later, hatches flew open and the crew began bailing out, dropping to the road and sprinting for cover. The remaining 3 Tigers reacted instantly, their commanders dropping into their cupolas as the massive tanks began traversing their turrets toward the ridge. But Holbrook was already shouting into the radio, and all 3 Shermans were backing down the reverse slope of the ridge, engines roaring, track blocks throwing mud. The first 88mm round from the second Tiger screamed over the ridge, missing the rapidly retreating Shermans by 20 yards. By the time the second round arrived, the Shermans were in defilade, invisible to the German gunners. Behind them, the lead Tiger continued to burn. Early sat in his gunner's seat, hands shaking now, adrenaline flooding through him in waves. He'd just done something that wasn't supposed to be possible. He'd knocked out a Tiger at 1,800 yards with a single shot from a 76mm gun. His first shot. A shot that the ballistic tables said was right at the edge of theoretical possibility. "Hell of a shot, Early," Holbrook said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Hell of a shot." But even as his crew congratulated him, even as Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the radio requesting confirmation of the kill, Early understood something crucial. He'd been extraordinarily lucky. The range had been at the absolute maximum effective distance. The Tiger had been stationary and perfectly broadside. The armor, by chance, must have been on the thinner end of manufacturing tolerances. The round hadn't yawed or tumbled. Everything, every single variable, had aligned in his favor. It was, in every sense, an impossible shot that had somehow connected. To understand how impossible and why it mattered, we need to step back and examine the technological and industrial forces that had brought these 2 machines, and their crews, to this moment. The story of the 76mm gun's development begins not with American armored doctrine, but with American underestimation. In 1942, when the M4 Sherman entered production armed with the medium-velocity 75mm M3 gun, U.S. Army Ordnance considered it more than adequate for the tank's intended role. The Sherman was designed as a cruiser tank, fast, reliable, and capable of exploiting breakthroughs created by combined arms assaults. Tank versus tank combat was considered a secondary mission at best. The 75mm gun could penetrate 88mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 yards when firing perpendicular to the plate, sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of the Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks that dominated German armored forces in North Africa. American planners believed that dedicated tank destroyers, not medium tanks, should bear primary responsibility for defeating enemy armor. This doctrine worked adequately against the Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs. But in late 1942, Germany introduced the Tiger I, and in early 1943, the Panther. Both tanks mounted guns and armor that rendered the Sherman's 75mm gun largely ineffective in frontal engagements. The Tiger I's frontal armor of 100mm at the glacis, significantly thicker than the Sherman could defeat except at point-blank range, combined with the powerful 88mm gun, created a vehicle that could engage and destroy Shermans from distances where return fire was futile. The Panther was worse. Its sloped 80mm glacis, angled at 55 degrees, presented a line of sight thickness of 140mm. The Sherman's 75mm gun had virtually no chance of penetration against this armor at any range. American tank crews in North Africa and Italy learned these limitations through bitter experience. Reports from the field became increasingly urgent through 1943 and early 1944. Crews reported moral problems, fear of engaging German armor, and a deep sense of being sacrificed in machines they knew to be inferior. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had actually begun work on a more powerful gun, even before the Sherman encountered Tigers. In September 1940, the 3-inch M1918 anti-aircraft gun had been adapted for anti-tank use, creating the 3-inch gun M1918. This gun showed promise but was too heavy for the Sherman's turret and mount. A new gun was needed. Development of what would become the 76mm gun M1 began in earnest in 1942. The designation 76mm rather than 3-inch was deliberate. Despite both having a bore of 76.2 millimeters, ordnance officials wanted to prevent any confusion or ammunition mixing between the guns. The 76mm gun used a lighter barrel than the 3-inch, incorporated the breech ring assembly from the 75mm gun, and could be mounted in a modified Sherman turret. The gun's performance was a substantial improvement over the 75mm. Firing the M62 armor-piercing ballistic cap round at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, the 76mm could penetrate 109 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards against a perpendicular plate at 30-degree obliquity. This represented nearly double the penetration of the 75mm at the same range. But there was a problem, and it was one that would plague the 76mm Sherman throughout its service life. Even this improved performance wasn't enough against the frontal armor of Panthers or Tigers. The Panthers' sloped glacis remained effectively immune, and the Tigers' frontal armor could only be reliably defeated at ranges under 500 yards, dangerously close for a Sherman facing an 88mm gun. The first M4 tanks armed with 76mm guns were produced in January 1944. Tanks equipped with the gun began arriving in Britain in April 1944, just 2 months before D-Day. But there was resistance to their deployment. The 76mm gun had a much heavier muzzle blast than the 75mm, creating a dust cloud that could take 8 to 30 seconds to clear, drastically reducing the rate of effective fire. More critically, the 76mm high explosive round contained only 0.86 pounds of explosive filler compared to 0.47 pounds in the 75mm round. Since the Sherman's primary mission was infantry support, many commanders preferred to keep the 75mm gun with its superior high explosive capability. As a result, no 76mm Shermans participated in the D-Day landings. The first 76mm equipped tanks to see combat arrived in Normandy in July 1944 and immediately encountered the Panthers and Tigers they'd been designed to fight. The results were disappointing. While the 76mm could engage Panthers and Tigers from the flanks and rear with reasonable success, frontal engagements remained nearly hopeless. General Dwight Eisenhower, upon learning that the new gun still couldn't reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor, reportedly erupted in frustration. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm always the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The complaint was somewhat unfair. The 76mm could knock out Panthers and Tigers, but only with flank or rear shots, and only if crews were skilled and lucky enough to get into position. But Eisenhower's frustration reflected the reality that American tankers felt every day. Even with the improved gun, they were still fundamentally outmatched in armor-on-armor combat. There was, however, one more round in the magazine, literally. In August 1944, a new type of ammunition began trickling to American tank units in Europe. The M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round, universally known as HVAP, represented a technological leap. The HVAP round used a tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum sabot. The core weighed only 6 pounds compared to 15 pounds for a standard armor-piercing round, but the lighter projectile could be accelerated to much higher velocities. The M93, achieved a muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, 800 feet per second faster than standard rounds. This dramatic increase in velocity translated to dramatically improved penetration. The HVAP round could penetrate 178 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. This was finally a performance that could threaten even Panther frontal armor. A 76mm Sherman firing HVAP could penetrate a Panther's turret mantelet at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against Tigers, HVAP could defeat frontal armor at ranges where the Sherman had some chance of survival. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. Tungsten was in desperately short supply. The entire world's tungsten production, most of it coming from China, Brazil, and the United States, was consumed by dozens of war industries. Tungsten was needed for armor-piercing ammunition across all calibers, for cutting tools in war industries, for electrical contacts, for high-temperature applications. There simply wasn't enough to go around. As a result, HVAP ammunition arrived in Europe in tiny quantities. The first 2,000 rounds were airshipped to France in August 1944. By March 1945, only 18,000 HVAP rounds total had reached the European theater, and 42% of those went to tank destroyer units, not to Sherman tanks. Distribution was tightly controlled. Most Sherman crews received only a handful of HVAP rounds, if they received any at all. Crews hoarded them for desperate situations, knowing they might represent their only chance against frontal armor. Orders specified that HVAP was to be issued primarily to tank destroyer battalions, whose M36 destroyers mounting 90mm guns were considered the primary anti-tank weapon. Regular Sherman crews often never saw a single HVAP round during months of combat. This scarcity meant that, in practice, the 76mm Sherman in early 1945 was still largely dependent on the standard M62 armor-piercing round, the same round that Robert Early fired that April morning near Paderborn. And with that round, at 1,800 yards against a Tiger's side armor, the shot that Early made represented the absolute edge of theoretical possibility. The ballistic mathematics were unforgiving. The M62 round left the muzzle at 2,600 feet per second. Air resistance continuously bled away velocity as the projectile flew downrange. Velocity loss wasn't linear. It accelerated as the projectile slowed, following complex aerodynamic curves. By 1,800 yards, the round would have lost roughly 800 feet per second, arriving at the target at approximately 1,800 feet per second. Penetration capability depended on kinetic energy, which decreased with the square of velocity. A projectile traveling at 2,600 feet per second had more than twice the penetrating power of the same projectile at 1,800 feet per second. The British firing tables that Early had glimpsed during training indicated that against 82 millimeters of armor at 30-degree obliquity, the 76-millimeter gun's performance dropped off sharply beyond 1,600 yards. At 1,800 yards, penetration became marginal, theoretically possible against armor of average quality, hit at a favorable angle but far from guaranteed. Multiple factors had to align perfectly for penetration at this range. The armor plate had to be on the thinner end of manufacturing tolerances. German armor quality varied significantly by 1945, as material shortages forced the use of inferior steel and rushed production processes created inconsistent results. The impact angle had to be close to perpendicular. Even a few degrees of obliquity could cause the round to deflect. The round itself had to be free of manufacturing defects and couldn't tumble or yaw during its 2-second flight. The range estimation had to be accurate within a few dozen yards. Too close, and the round would strike high too far and it would strike low, possibly hitting the more heavily armored lower hull or missing entirely. All of these variables had aligned for Early. The Tiger he engaged was stationary, presenting a perfect broadside at a moment when its commander was looking the wrong direction. The range, while extreme, fell within the narrow window where penetration was theoretically possible. The impact location was optimal. The armor quality was probably below German specification due to late war production problems. The round flew true. The 3 remaining Tigers did not withdraw. German tank doctrine emphasized aggressive counteraction, and the Panzer crews were well-trained veterans who understood that allowing American tanks to control the ridge meant surrendering the initiative. Within minutes of the first Tiger's destruction, the surviving tanks began maneuvering to flank the American position. Early's crew, along with the 2 other Shermans, had pulled back half a mile to a secondary position among a grove of damaged farm buildings. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio with updates from infantry observers who'd maintained eyes on the Tigers. The German tanks had split up. One remained near the burning hulk of the lead Tiger, providing overwatch, while the other 2 were working their way north, apparently seeking a route to higher ground where they could engage the Shermans from advantageous positions. "They're not running," Holbrook observed, his binoculars trained on the distant ridgeline. "They want payback." Early felt the weight of that statement. He'd knocked out one Tiger with a lucky shot at extreme range, but the odds of repeating. Performance approached 0. The remaining German commanders would be alert now, scanning constantly, and they wouldn't present stationary broadside targets. Any engagement would happen at closer range, where the Tiger's superior armor and firepower would dominate. The radio brought new orders from the battalion. Tank destroyers were finally en route. 2 M36 Jacksons with 90mm guns, estimated arrival 20 minutes. The Shermans were to maintain position, keep the Tigers occupied, and avoid decisive engagement if possible. 20 minutes, an eternity in tank combat. Early used the lull to think through what had happened. His shot had connected, yes, but the Tiger's destruction wasn't solely due to penetration. The initial impact had breached the hull, but the catastrophic secondary explosion suggested his round had detonated ammunition or fuel. A clean penetration might have wounded the crew and forced abandonment, but the spectacular fireball indicated he'd hit something vital inside the fighting compartment. This was the nature of armor combat that training manuals couldn't fully convey. The chaos of variables, the role of chance, the way a millimeter's difference in impact point could mean the difference between a deadly hit and a harmless ricochet. Early had been taught to aim for specific weak points: the lower glacis where armor was thinner, the turret ring where plates joined, the rear deck where engine compartments were vulnerable. But at 1,800 yards such precision was impossible. He'd aimed for center mass and hoped. The hope had been rewarded. Once. DiCenzo broke the silence in the turret. "How many rounds of HVAP did we got?" "None," Holbrook replied flatly. "We never received any allocation. It all went to the tank destroyer battalions." The loader swore softly. HVAP rounds, the tungsten core ammunition that could penetrate Panther frontal armor at fighting ranges, represented the technological edge that might have evened the odds. But the Sherman crews of 3rd Armored Division's line companies rarely saw them. The precious ammunition was reserved for the M36 tank destroyers, whose 90mm guns could make better use of the enhanced penetration. This allocation decision made strategic sense at higher echelons. Tank destroyers were purpose-built tank killers, faster and more maneuverable than Shermans, with guns optimized for anti-armor work. Concentrating HVAP ammunition where it could have maximum effect was rational resource allocation. But from inside a Sherman turret, facing Tigers with only standard armor-piercing rounds, the decision felt like abandonment. Movement caught Early's attention through his periscope. One of the tigers had appeared on the northern ridgeline, approximately 1,200 yards distant. The range was closer than his first engagement, but this tiger wasn't stationary. It was moving along the ridge, turret traversing as it searched for targets. "Tiger, 1,200 yards, 2 o'clock," Early reported. "I see him," Holbrook confirmed. "Hold fire. He hasn't spotted us yet." The German tank continued its movement, the commander visible in the cupola, scanning with binoculars. At this range, the Sherman's 76mm gun had reasonable penetration capability against the Tiger's side armor, if they could get a shot. But the Tiger was moving, and a moving target at 1,200 yards represented an entirely different challenge than a stationary one at 1,800. The Tiger suddenly stopped, its turret snapping toward the farm buildings where the Shermans were concealed. For a terrible moment, Early thought they'd been spotted. Then the Tiger's main gun fired, the muzzle blast visible even at this distance, and the round screamed overhead to impact somewhere behind the American position. "He's firing blind," Holbrook said. "Suppressive fire on suspected positions." The Tiger fired again, then began moving once more, working its way along the ridge. German tank tactics emphasized fire and movement. One tank would suppress suspected enemy positions while others maneuvered. The pattern was familiar to American tankers who'd fought in Normandy and the Siegfried Line. The Germans were professionals, and they were executing a textbook flanking maneuver. The second Tiger appeared 500 yards to the east of the first, also on the ridgeline. The Americans were being bracketed. If the Tigers could establish positions on the high ground with overlapping fields of fire, they could dominate the valley and eliminate the Shermans methodically. Morrison's voice came over the radio. "All Anvil units, we need to break contact and fall back to secondary positions. They're getting the high ground." But before any of the Shermans could move, the eastern Tiger's gun fired. The round struck one of the other Shermans in Early's platoon, a tank commanded by Sergeant Willis, with a sound like a giant hammer striking an anvil. The Sherman lurched, smoke immediately pouring from its engine deck. Hatches flew open and the crew bailed out, dropping to the ground and sprinting for cover as flames erupted from the stricken tank. "Anvil 3 is hit," someone shouted over the radio. "The crew is out. The tank is burning." The engagement had turned decisively against the Americans. 2 Tigers on the high ground, 1 Sherman destroyed, and the tank destroyers still 15 minutes away. Early watched through his periscope as Willis and his crew reached cover behind a stone wall. All 5 men had made it out. That was something. But the platoon was now down to 2 functional tanks against 2 Tigers, with a 3rd Tiger, presumably still in overwatch position near the original engagement site. "All Anvil units, displace now," Morrison ordered. "Fall back to Rally Point Delta." Holbrook was already shouting orders to the driver. "Back us out, reverse, head for that tree line at 8 o'clock. The Sherman's engine roared as the driver threw it into reverse, the tank backing rapidly out of its concealment. Early kept his eyes pressed to the periscope, watching the Tigers on the ridge. The western Tiger's turret was traversing, tracking the movement. Early saw the muzzle flash and instinctively braced. The 88mm round missed, but not by much. It struck the ground 15 yards to the left, throwing up a fountain of mud and debris that splattered across the Sherman's hull. The driver was reversing at full speed now, engine screaming, the tank bouncing violently over rough ground. A second round from the eastern Tiger screamed past the turret so close that Early heard it, a sound like tearing canvas, impossibly loud even through the armor. The round impacted behind them, and then the Sherman was into the tree line, branches scraping across the turret as the driver maneuvered between trunks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Sherman emerged from the tree line still in reverse, now on the far side of a low hill that provided some defilade from the Tigers. The driver spun the tank around, shifting into forward gear, and they began moving west at speed toward Rally Point Delta, a crossroads 2 miles distant where infantry and artillery support was concentrated. Over the radio, Early heard Lieutenant Morrison coordinating with the battalion. The tank destroyers were still 10 minutes out. The Tigers were advancing. Morrison's own Sherman and Early's tank were falling back, but they couldn't fall back too far. Infantry positions at Edom depended on armor support, and withdrawing completely would leave them vulnerable. The tactical situation had deteriorated into a fighting retreat, with American armor trying to delay German armor just long enough for heavier guns to arrive. It was exactly the kind of engagement that American doctrine tried to avoid. Sherman's trading shots with Tigers in situations where the Germans held every advantage. Holbrook was studying his map, plotting routes. There's a sunken road about 800 yards ahead. Good hold-down positions, overlooks the approach from Ettlin. If we can get there before the Tigers close up, we might be able to hold them. 800 yards ahead meant 800 yards closer to the Tigers, who were presumably still advancing from the ridgeline. The timing would be tight, but Holbrook was right. The sunken road offered the kind of defensive position that could partially offset the Tigers' advantages. A hull-down Sherman, with only its turret exposed, presented a much smaller and harder target, and if the Tigers came at them from below, the angle might allow shots at the thinner roof armor. "Driver, make for the sunken road. Best speed," Holbrook ordered. The Sherman accelerated, diesel engine roaring, tracks chewing up the muddy ground. Early braced himself in the gunner's position, trying to keep his sight picture stable despite the violent motion. Through the periscope, he caught glimpses of the ridge line they'd abandoned, and dark shapes moving along it. The Tigers were pursuing. The nature of American armor production in World War II represented industrial mobilization on a scale never before attempted. From July 1942 through July 1945, American factories produced 49,324 Sherman tanks across 11 different manufacturing facilities. This represented more than 8 times the total production of Tigers and Panthers combined. Germany produced only 1,835 Tigers and 4,800 Panthers during the entire war. The production disparity reflected fundamentally different strategic philosophies. Germany prioritized quality over quantity, designing highly capable tanks with powerful guns and heavy armor, accepting lower production numbers as the price of superior individual performance. The United States prioritized quantity and reliability, designing tanks that could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and deployed in overwhelming numbers. Both approaches had merit, and both had fatal flaws. German tanks were formidable in individual combat. A Tiger or Panther could dominate American armor in one-on-one engagements, destroying Shermans at ranges where return fire was ineffective. German crews were often highly trained veterans who maximized their vehicles' capabilities. German tactical doctrine emphasized the qualitative advantage, using superior tanks to defeat numerically superior enemies through better positioning and gunnery. But the German approach suffered from crippling limitations. Complex designs meant slow production and difficult maintenance. The Tiger's overlapping road wheel suspension, which gave excellent cross-country performance, was notoriously difficult to maintain in field conditions. Frozen mud between the wheels could immobilize the tank completely, and replacing damaged wheels required removing multiple other wheels first. Panthers suffered from transmission problems that frequently left them stranded. Both tanks consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and Germany's fuel situation deteriorated steadily throughout 1944 and 45. Most critically, Germany couldn't replace losses. A Tiger destroyed in combat represented months of scarce production capacity lost. By 1945, German armored divisions were increasingly paper formations, authorized Tiger or Panther companies that existed in unit tables but had only a handful of operational tanks, or none at all. The American approach accepted higher individual losses in exchange for overwhelming aggregate superiority. Shermans were designed for mass production using standardized components that could be manufactured in plants across the country, including facilities that had previously made automobiles, locomotives, or industrial machinery. The Sherman used a relatively simple suspension, a reliable engine, multiple engine types were used, all proven in other applications, and a straightforward hull design that could be fabricated quickly. Maintenance was simple enough that crew-level repairs could handle most problems. A Sherman could be field-stripped and rebuilt with basic tools. Parts were interchangeable between vehicles. The logistics train supporting American armor delivered spare parts, ammunition, and fuel in quantities that German forces could only dream of. Most importantly, Shermans could be replaced. A tank destroyed today would be replaced by 2 or 3 tanks next week. American armored divisions maintained replacement pools that kept frontline units at full strength despite ongoing losses. Crews knew that if their tank was knocked out, they'd get another one. This knowledge didn't eliminate fear, but it provided a kind of institutional resilience that German forces increasingly lacked. The production numbers told the story. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 17,781 Shermans. Germany produced 385 Tigers and 3,920 Panthers that same year, less than 1/5 the American production. And those numbers included tanks that never reached the front due to fuel shortages, air attacks on rail transport, or mechanical failures during delivery. By April 1945, when Robert Early engaged Tigers near Paderborn, the strategic implications of this production disparity had become crushingly apparent. Germany had perhaps 200 operational Tigers remaining in service across all fronts. The United States had thousands of Shermans in Europe alone, with thousands more in depots, in transit, or rolling off production lines. But this strategic reality provided cold comfort to individual Sherman crews facing individual Tigers in individual engagements. The crew of a Sherman didn't fight aggregate statistics. They fought the specific Tiger in their gun sight, and at that tactical level, they were outmatched. The 76mm gun represented America's attempt to narrow the tactical gap without abandoning the strategic advantages of mass production. The gun could be installed in existing Sherman hulls with relatively minor modifications, allowing rapid deployment to units in the field. It provided better anti-armor performance without sacrificing the Sherman's reliability or ease of maintenance. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't match the Panther's 75mm L70 or the Tiger's 88, but it was good enough to give Sherman crews a fighting chance. Good enough? That phrase encapsulated American armor philosophy in Europe. The Sherman wasn't the best tank, but it was good enough when supported by artillery, air power, infantry, and numerical superiority. The 76mm gun wasn't the best anti-tank weapon, but it was good enough when crews could maneuver for flank shots, or when tank destroyers could handle the heaviest threats. Good enough. If you were lucky, skilled, and willing to accept that sometimes good enough wasn't quite enough. Early Sherman reached the sunken road with perhaps 90 seconds to spare. The road had been cut through a low ridge, creating banks 3 to 4 feet high on either side, perfect for a hull-down position. Holbrook directed the driver to position the tank so only the turret was exposed above the northern bank, providing a field of fire toward Ettlin while protecting the vulnerable hull. Lieutenant Morrison's tank took position 50 yards to the left, similarly hull down. Both tanks now commanded the approach route the Tigers would have to use if they continued their advance toward the crossroads. "Load armor piercing," Holbrook ordered, though DiCenzo already had an AP round chambered. Through his periscope, Early scanned the terrain to the north. Rolling farmland interrupted by small copses of trees and the occasional stone farmhouse. Movement to perhaps 1,500 yards. The Tigers, advancing in a staggered formation that kept them mutually supporting while presenting difficult targets. Early counted 3 Tigers now visible. The third tank, the one that had remained in overwatch during the earlier engagement, had joined the other 2 in the pursuit. 3 Tigers against 2 Shermans, all converging on the sunken road. The range was decreasing steadily. 1,400 yards. 1,300. The Tigers were moving cautiously now, their commanders clearly aware that American tanks were somewhere ahead. But the sunken road was difficult to spot from the north. Just another landscape feature among many, easy to overlook until you were right on top of it. 1,200 yards. 1,100. "Wait for it," Holbrook said quietly. "Let them close. We get better odds at a shorter range, and if we fire too early, we lose the element of surprise." Early's hands were steady on the gun controls now, the earlier adrenaline replaced by a cold, focused calm. He'd made one impossible shot today. The odds of making another were vanishingly small, but at shorter ranges, the shot became merely improbable rather than impossible. 1,000 yards. 900. The lead Tiger was advancing directly toward Early's position, its turret traversing slowly as the commander searched for threats. The tank was buttoned up now, all hatches closed, the crew operating from inside the armored shell. This made them safer, but also partially blind, dependent on narrow vision slits and periscopes that severely limited situational awareness. 800 yards. 700. "Steady," Holbrook murmured. At 650 yards, the lead Tiger stopped. Its turret traversed left, then right, searching. Through his gun sight, Early could see the gun barrel, the mantlet, the hull front with its nearly impenetrable 100mm armor. A frontal shot at this range would be futile. The round would simply bounce off. But the Tiger wasn't presenting a frontal aspect. It was angled perhaps 30 degrees relative to Early's position, enough to expose a portion of its side armor. "Target, lead Tiger, range 650, Early reported. "Angled, partial side aspect." "Wait," Holbrook said. "Let him turn more." The Tiger's turret continued traversing, the long 88mm gun sweeping across the landscape. The tank began moving again, angling further to the left, presenting more of its side. "Now," Holbrook said. "Fire when ready." Early placed his reticle on the hull, just forward of the turret, where the side armor was vertical. He made a slight elevation adjustment for the 650-yard range, trivial compared to his earlier shot, and verified the sight picture. The 76mm gun fired. Through the smoke and recoil, Early watched his tracer arc toward the target. The flight time was barely a second at this range. The round struck the Tiger's side armor and deflected. Early saw the bright spark of metal on metal, saw his round ricochet upward at a sharp angle and disappear into the sky. "Miss," he reported, the word bitter in his mouth. "Round deflected." DiCenzo already had another round chambered. The Tiger was reacting, its turret snapping toward the muzzle flash from Early's position. At 650 yards, the Tiger's 88mm gun would punch through the Sherman's turret armor like tissue paper. "Traverse left! Traverse left!" Holbrook shouted. Early was already moving, cranking the turret traverse control to rotate away from the Tiger's gun. But hand traverse was painfully slow. The turret moved at perhaps 4 degrees per second when cranked manually. The Tiger's powered traverse was much faster. The Tiger fired. The round struck the bank in front of Early's Sherman, missing the hull by perhaps 2 feet, showering the tank with dirt and rocks. Only the hull-down position had saved them. If they'd been exposed, the shot would have been lethal. Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman fired its 76-millimeter gun targeting the same Tiger from a different angle. Morrison's round struck the Tiger's turret, and Early saw the impact flash. But again, deflection. The Tiger's turret armor had turned the round aside. The Tiger rotated its turret toward Morrison's position and fired. This round struck Morrison's Sherman directly in the turret front. The impact was catastrophic. The Sherman's turret rang like a bell, visible even from Early's position, and smoke began pouring from the hatches. Morrison and his crew began bailing out, dropping from the stricken tank and running for cover. 2 Shermans down. Early's tank was now alone against 3 Tigers. "Back us out," Holbrook ordered. "Reverse! Reverse!" The driver threw the Sherman into Tutto. Reverse. Backing down the southern slope of the sunken road, putting the ridge between them and the Tigers. 88-millimeter rounds began impacting along the ridge, the Tigers firing at where Early's tank had been, bracketing the position with high explosive shells. "Keep moving! Head west!" Holbrook was shouting into the radio now, calling for the tank destroyers, demanding to know where they were. The response came back. 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. Early's Sherman was racing west along a farm track, the Tigers presumably in pursuit. The crew was silent now, each man focused on his job. Driver navigating at speed, loader ready with another round, Holbrook scanning for threats, Early searching for any position that might offer a fighting chance. Then Early saw them. 2 dark shapes approaching from the west at high speed M36. Jackson tank destroyers, their long 90-millimeter guns unmistakable. The Jacksons were moving fast, taking advantage of their superior speed, 50 miles per hour compared to the Sherman's 25, to close the distance. "Tank destroyers are here," Holbrook announced over the radio. "Anvil 5, Anvil 6, we've got 3 Tigers 600 yards northeast of our position, advancing west." The lead Jackson didn't slow down. It came racing past Early's Sherman, the commander visible in the open turret, and immediately began engaging. The 90-millimeter gun fired. The muzzle blast was enormous, and Early saw the round impact one of the pursuing Tigers. This time, there was no deflection. The 90-millimeter round punched through the Tiger's frontal armor, and the massive German tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The second Jackson had swung wide, flanking to the north, and engaged another Tiger from the side at perhaps 400 yards. The 90-millimeter gun fired again, and this Tiger too was struck. The round penetrated, and seconds later the tank erupted in flames as ammunition detonated. The third Tiger had seen enough. Its commander, recognizing he was now outnumbered and outgunned, reversed course and began withdrawing at speed, smoke grenades popping from the launchers to cover the retreat. The Jacksons pursued briefly but didn't press the attack. The immediate threat was neutralized. 2 Tigers destroyed, 1 withdrawing. The crossroads at Edlin was secure. Early sat in his gunner's seat, hands shaking again, the familiar post-combat adrenaline crash washing over him. His impossible first shot had knocked out a Tiger at 1,800 yards. His second shot at 650 yards had bounced harmlessly off armor. The difference wasn't his skill. The difference was luck, angle, armor quality, and 100 other variables he couldn't control. The tank destroyers had done what they were designed to do: engage and destroy German armor with guns, powerful enough to defeat heavy armor frontally. The 90-millimeter gun could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at the ranges where the engagement had occurred. The Jacksons were purpose-built tank killers, and they'd killed tanks. Early Sherman had survived by luck, terrain, and the timely arrival of heavier guns. That was the reality of armor combat in April 1945. Shermans held the line, took losses, and waited for tank destroyers or air support to handle the threats they couldn't. The engagement near Paderborn on April 1st, 1945, never made it into history books as a significant action. Battalion records noted the loss of 2 M4 Shermans and credited Robert Early with 1 Tiger destroyed at extreme range. But the engagement was a footnote in a campaign that was rapidly approaching its conclusion. Within days, American forces would cross the Rhine in strength, and German resistance would begin its final collapse. Early's crew received no special recognition for the Tiger kill. Holbrook put Early in for a Bronze Star, but the recommendation was downgraded to a commendation. Extreme-range tank kills weren't rare enough in the final months of the war to merit higher awards. Early himself was uncomfortable with the attention. He knew how lucky he'd been, how many variables had aligned in his favor, how easily the shot could have missed. But the engagement illustrated something important about American armor doctrine and the 76-millimeter gun's place within it. The gun was never intended to make Shermans competitive with Tigers or Panthers in one-on-one duels. It was intended to give Sherman crews a better chance, to expand the envelope of ranges and angles at which penetration was possible, to provide options that the 75-millimeter gun couldn't. At 1,800 yards, Early's shot represented the absolute outer limit of that envelope. Everything had to be perfect: range, angle, armor quality, shot placement, weather conditions. Change any variable, and the shot fails. This wasn't reliable performance. It was a statistical edge case made reality through extraordinary luck. At 650 yards, Early's deflected round represented the more typical experience. Even with the improved 76-millimeter gun, even at moderate range, Tiger armor could turn aside American projectiles when the angle wasn't favorable or the armor was above specification. The tank destroyer's success at 400 yards with 90-millimeter guns represented the American solution to the German armor threat. Specialized vehicles with powerful guns deployed where needed, supporting the more numerous but less capable Shermans. This was the system working as designed. Shermans engaged where they could, withdrew when overmatched, and called for support from heavier guns. The system wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't fair to individual Sherman crews who found themselves facing Tigers, but it was effective at the strategic level. By war's end, the United States had lost approximately 4,000 Shermans in combat in Northwest Europe. This number sounds catastrophic until compared to production figures. 4,000 losses against 49,000 produced, with thousands more in reserve. The American industrial base could absorb these losses. Germany could not. The Tigers that Early's platoon engaged near Paderborn were almost certainly among the last operational Tigers on the Western Front. By April 1945, German armored formations were shadows of their former strength, operating with mixed units cobbled together from survivors of destroyed battalions. Fuel shortages meant that tanks were often towed into position by tractors, fired from static positions, and then towed away. Ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Replacement parts were unavailable. The war would end 5 weeks after the Paderborn engagement. The Tigers that survived, and very few did, would be captured or destroyed where they stood, out of fuel and ammunition, abandoned by crews who recognized the futility of further resistance. Early mustered out in November 1945 and returned to Wisconsin. He worked at his family's dairy farm for 47 years, rarely speaking about the war. In a brief interview in 1992, he was asked about the long-range tiger kill. His response was characteristically modest. "I got lucky. The tiger was there. We needed to stop it. I took the shot. It connected. If I'd missed, someone else would have gotten him eventually. That's how it worked." That's how it worked. American armor doctrine in a single sentence. Individual Shermans might be outmatched. Individual crews might be outgunned. But the system as a whole would prevail through numbers, logistics, and the certainty that there was always someone else coming. The 76-millimeter gun gave crews like Early's a fighting chance where the 75-millimeter offered none. It expanded the range of possible outcomes, created opportunities for skilled or lucky crews to achieve results that doctrine said were impossible. It wasn't enough to make the Sherman a match for German heavy armor, but it was enough to make the difference between hopeless and merely desperate. And in desperate times, against impossible odds, that difference sometimes meant everything. The technical specifications of the engagement reveal just how remarkable and unrepeatable Early's first shot truly was. Ballistic calculations suggest the M62 armor-piercing round was traveling at approximately 1,780 feet per second when it struck the Tiger's hull. At this velocity, penetration of 82-millimeter armor was theoretically possible, but required the projectile to strike within a narrow angle of perpendicularity. Estimates suggest no more than 15 to 20 degrees of obliquity could be tolerated at this impact velocity. The Tiger's hull side at the point of impact was vertical, providing the optimal 90-degree impact angle. Had the tank been angled even slightly toward Early's position, the effective armor thickness would have increased due to slope, and the round would almost certainly have deflected. Had the Tiger been moving, leading the target at 1,800 yards would have been nearly impossible with the optical sights available in Sherman tanks. The projectile itself had to remain stable through 2 seconds of flight. At supersonic velocities, any manufacturing imperfection in the shell, an off-center center of gravity, irregular rifling engagement, asymmetric windshield, could cause yaw or tumble that would drastically reduce penetration or cause the round to miss entirely. Quality control in American ammunition production was good but not perfect, particularly as production ramped up to meet wartime demands. The armor plate struck by Early's round was likely on the thinner end of specification tolerances and of below-average quality. German armor steel in 1945 suffered from material shortages that forced the use of inferior alloys and from rushed production processes that created inconsistent hardness and brittleness. Testing of captured German armor from this period showed significant variation in quality, with some plates being substantially weaker than specification, while others exceeded it. All of these factors, optimal angle, stable flight, quality variation, precise range estimation, had to align simultaneously for penetration to occur. The statistical probability of all variables aligning favorably is difficult to calculate precisely, but was certainly well under 10%, possibly under 5%. Early's second shot, at 650 yards against a partially angled target, had a much higher theoretical probability of penetration, perhaps 30 to 40% under test conditions. Yet it deflected. This illustrates the chaotic nature of armor combat. Theory predicts probabilities, but individual engagements are binary outcomes. The shot either penetrates or it doesn't, regardless of what the tables say should happen. The tank destroyer's shots, by contrast, had penetration probabilities approaching or exceeding 80%. The 90-millimeter gun-firing M82 armor-piercing rounds at 400 yards against Tiger frontal armor represented the kind of engagement that American planners had always intended should handle German heavy tanks. This wasn't luck. This was overwhelming firepower applied with tactical precision. The broader implications of Early's engagement extend beyond the tactical details. The story illustrates the fundamental tension in American armor policy during World War II, the tension between the strategic requirement for mass production and the tactical requirement for individual superiority. American planners understood that designing and producing a tank that could match the Tiger or Panther one for one would slow production, complicate logistics, and undermine the numerical advantage that American industry could provide. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, mounting a 90mm gun and heavier armor, entered production too late to affect the war's outcome. Only 20 Pershings saw combat before Germany's surrender. Had America committed to Pershing production earlier, the total number of tanks available would have been substantially lower. The Sherman, despite its limitations against heavy German armor, was the right tank for America's strategic needs. It could be produced in vast numbers, shipped efficiently across oceans, maintained with available parts and skills, and deployed in the combined arms teams that American doctrine emphasized. The 76mm gun improved the Sherman's anti-armor capability, just enough to make it viable in the new tactical environment without compromising the strategic advantages. But this strategic calculation came at a human cost. Sherman crews knew they were outgunned and out-armored. They knew that engaging Tigers or Panthers meant accepting terrible odds. They knew that survival often depended on factors beyond their control: the availability of tank destroyer support, air cover, artillery, or simply the luck to avoid encountering German heavy armor. The psychological burden of operating inferior equipment in combat conditions cannot be overstated. Crews developed dark humor, fatalistic attitudes, and intense bonds with their fellow tankers. They learned to maximize their tanks' advantages, speed, reliability, numbers, while minimizing exposure to situations where German advantages dominated. Early's impossible shot represented a moment when all the disadvantages were temporarily overcome, when luck and skill aligned to produce an outcome that shouldn't have been possible. But the very impossibility of the shot underscored the broader reality: that Sherman crews were expected to fight battles where the odds were stacked against them, where victory required either overwhelming numbers or extraordinary circumstances. The 76mm gun was America's compromise between ideal and possible, between what armor crews needed and what industry could provide. It wasn't the best solution, but in the calculus of total war, where strategic requirements, industrial capacity, and tactical effectiveness had to be balanced, it was probably the only practical solution. That it worked at all was testament to the crews who operated it. That it sometimes worked brilliantly, as it did for Robert Early on that April morning, was testament to the thin margin between defeat and survival that characterized armored warfare on the Western Front. The final weeks of the war in Europe saw American armored forces racing across Germany against collapsing resistance. By mid-April 1945, German armored formations had ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. Individual tanks, Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, still appeared in combat, often dug in as static pillboxes or operating in ad hoc battle groups assembled from training units and stragglers. But the massed Panzer divisions that had terrorized Allied planners in 1944 were gone, destroyed by attrition, fuel starvation, and the crushing weight of Allied air superiority. Robert Early's crew continued to operate their 76mm Sherman through these final weeks. They encountered German armor twice more before the surrender. Once a Panzer IV that withdrew before engagement. Once a Panther abandoned by its crew for lack of fuel. The dramatic tank versus tank duels that had characterized fighting in Normandy and the Ardennes gave way to a different kind of warfare: urban combat, reducing fortified positions, accepting surrenders from demoralized Wehrmacht units that had lost all will to continue. The 76mm gun proved useful in this environment, though not for its intended anti-armor purpose. The high-velocity gun could blast through the heavy masonry walls of German buildings that machine guns couldn't penetrate. It could destroy roadblocks, suppress sniper positions, and provide precision fire support for infantry clearing towns. These weren't the missions that had driven the gun's development, but they were the missions that mattered in April and May of 1945. Early's gunner's log for April shows the changing nature of combat. After the Paderborn engagement, he recorded firing 47 rounds over the next 3 weeks. Only 3 were armor-piercing rounds fired at suspected armor positions. The rest were high-explosive shells fired in support of infantry. The war had moved beyond tank combat into its final, grinding phase of occupation and collapse. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Early was near Dessau when the news arrived, and he recorded in a letter home that the crew's reaction was quiet relief rather than celebration. They'd survived. That was enough. His gunner's log shows no further entries after May 7th. The war was over. The legacy of the 76mm gun and the Shermans that carried it extends far beyond World War II. In the immediate post-war period, analysis of tank combat produced recommendations that would shape American armor development for decades. The most important lesson learned was that the tactical compromise, accepting inferior individual tank performance in exchange for strategic numerical superiority, had worked, but only barely. Against an enemy with better logistics, more fuel, and intact production, the Sherman's qualitative deficiencies might have proven catastrophic. Against Germany in 1944 and 45, facing fuel starvation, parts shortages, and constant air attack, the Sherman's advantages in reliability and numbers proved decisive. But the margin had been uncomfortably thin. American tankers had paid for strategic decisions with their lives. The delayed introduction of the 76mm gun, the scarcity of HVAP ammunition, the decision not to field the Pershing in larger numbers, all of these decisions made strategic sense but imposed tactical costs. Post-war doctrine would emphasize closing the qualitative gap. The M46 Patton, entering service in 1949, mounted a 90mm gun as standard and incorporated lessons learned from analyzing German armor. The M48 Patton, appearing in 1952, further increased firepower and armor. American tanks would never again enter combat with guns inadequate to defeat enemy armor frontally. The 76mm gun itself continued in service long after World War II ended. Surplus Shermans, equipped with the 76mm gun, were supplied to allied nations around the world: France, Israel, Pakistan, Yugoslavia, and dozens of others. The gun proved more than adequate against the armor these nations typically faced, and the Sherman's reliability remained legendary. In the Korean War, 76mm Shermans faced North Korean T-3485 tanks and proved roughly equivalent in combat capability. The 76mm could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges when firing HVAP ammunition, which was now available in much larger quantities than during World War II. American gunners, benefiting from superior optics and training, generally won these engagements. The gun that had struggled against Tigers and Panthers was perfectly adequate against Soviet-designed medium tanks. Israeli Defense Forces used 76mm Shermans with great success in the 1956 Suez Crisis and the 1967 Six-Day War. Israeli tankers, inheriting a tradition of aggressive tactics and excellent gunnery, extracted maximum performance from their aging Shermans. Against Egyptian and Syrian tanks of similar vintage, the 76-millimeter gun remained effective. The last combat use of 76-millimeter Shermans occurred during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, when both sides employed museum pieces and old reserves. By this point, the tanks were hopelessly obsolete by modern standards, but against infantry and light vehicles, they retained utility. The final combat firing of a 76-millimeter gun from a Sherman occurred in Bosnia in 1995, 50 years after the gun was designed, 50 years after Early's impossible shot near Paderborn. The technical evolution of tank armament continued long after the 76-millimeter gun became obsolete. The fundamental challenge that had driven the gun's development, how to defeat increasingly heavy armor, led to ever more powerful weapons. By the 1960s, standard tank guns had increased to 105 millimeters. By the 1970s, 120 millimeters became standard for main battle tanks. Modern armor-piercing ammunition uses depleted uranium or tungsten penetrators. Sophisticated composite armor has replaced homogeneous steel, and fire control systems incorporate laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. A modern M1 Abrams tank can reliably hit and penetrate targets at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters under conditions where a Sherman gunner couldn't even identify the target. The impossible shot that Early made at 1,800 yards, requiring perfect conditions and extraordinary luck, is now a routine engagement distance with near-certain first-round hit probability. But the fundamental dynamics that Early experienced remain relevant. Tank combat is still about managing probabilities, about creating situations where the odds favor your shot while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Superior technology helps. Modern tanks are vastly more capable than Shermans, but the principles of tactics, positioning, and calculated risk-taking remain unchanged. Modern tankers train on simulators that can recreate historical engagements, and some training programs include scenarios based on World War II tank combat. When presented with Early's engagement, hull-down position, extreme range, stationary target, most simulator participants choose not to take the shot. The risk of revealing position without achieving a kill seems too high. The computer awards those who make Early's choice with a hit perhaps 1 time in 10. The simulator can't recreate what Early felt in that moment, the knowledge that infantry positions depended on stopping the Tigers, that withdrawal meant abandoning the crossroads, that sometimes impossible shots are the only shots you have. The simulator can't model the human factors that turn statistical improbabilities into historical facts. The story of the 76-millimeter gun illuminates a broader truth about technological development in warfare. Weapons systems are always compromises between ideal performance and practical constraints. The ideal anti-tank gun for American forces in 1944 would have been a high-velocity 105-millimeter weapon capable of defeating any German armor at long range. But such a weapon couldn't have been mounted in existing Sherman hulls, would have required entirely new production lines, and would have delayed fielding by months or years. The 76-millimeter gun represented what was achievable within operational timeframes and industrial constraints. It provided substantial improvement over the 75-millimeter, enough to matter in combat, while remaining compatible with existing production and logistics. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real beats perfect when perfect arrives too late. This principle, that adequate solutions deployed quickly often outperform superior solutions deployed slowly, recurs throughout military history. The Sherman with a 76-millimeter gun wasn't the best tank of World War II, but it was good enough to win the war. The HVAP ammunition wasn't available in the quantities needed, but the limited quantities that reached crews provided critical capability at crucial moments. Early's impossible shot at Paderborn exemplifies both the limitations and possibilities of the 76mm gun. The limitation: penetration at such extreme range was so improbable that doctrine correctly advised against attempting it. The possibility: under the right circumstances, with skilled crews and favorable conditions, the gun could achieve results that exceeded theoretical expectations. Military technology must account for both statistical averages and extreme outliers. Planning assumes average performance under typical conditions, but combat often creates atypical conditions where average performance is insufficient. The 76mm gun's average performance against Tigers was inadequate for frontal engagements, hence the doctrine to avoid such engagements. But its extreme edge performance, when all variables aligned, could produce results like Early's. Modern weapons development still grapples with these same tensions. Should systems be optimized for average expected scenarios or for worst-case possibilities? Should resources be invested in incremental improvements to existing systems or revolutionary new designs? Should perfect solutions be delayed in favor of good enough solutions available sooner? The 76mm gun's history suggests answers. Incremental improvements matter. Good enough solutions deployed quickly can be more valuable than perfect solutions deployed slowly. And designing for average scenarios while retaining capability for extreme cases provides the best balance. In the decades since World War II, the mythology around American armor has undergone significant revision. Early post-war accounts, often influenced by German memoirs and histories, portrayed Sherman tanks as inferior Tommy Cookers that succeeded only through overwhelming numbers against superior German designs. This narrative emphasized German technological sophistication while downplaying American advantages in production, logistics, and combined arms integration. More recent scholarship has challenged this mythology. Detailed analysis of combat records shows that Sherman loss rates, while substantial, were not disproportionate to the tactical situations in which they operated. When properly employed with infantry, artillery, and air support, as American doctrine intended, Shermans were highly effective. When employed in isolation against German armor, contrary to doctrine, they suffered heavy losses, but so would any tank under those circumstances. The 76mm gun's reputation has benefited from this scholarly reassessment. Earlier accounts dismissed it as inadequate, pointing to its inability to penetrate Panther frontal armor. More nuanced analysis recognizes that the gun provided exactly the capability needed for the Sherman's actual role: infantry support with secondary anti-armor capability, supplemented by dedicated tank destroyers for heavy armor threats. Early's engagement demonstrates this nuance. His first shot, the impossible long-range hit, was outside doctrinal expectations and succeeded only through luck. His second shot, at more typical range, failed despite being within theoretical capability. The tank destroyers that arrived moments later, employing superior guns in their designed role, succeeded reliably. The system worked as intended, with the 76mm Sherman holding the line until heavier guns could engage. This is a less dramatic narrative than the mythology of heroic Shermans defeating Tigers through crew skill alone, but it's more accurate and ultimately more instructive. The lesson isn't that American tanks were individually superior. They weren't. The lesson is that American armor doctrine, industrial capacity, and combined arms integration created a system that could absorb tactical setbacks and still achieve strategic objectives. Individual engagements like Early's mattered. They maintained morale, they demonstrated that victory was possible even against heavy odds. They provided tactical successes that accumulated into operational advantages. But they weren't the decisive factor. The decisive factor was that for every Sherman knocked out, 2 more were already en route from depots, while German losses couldn't be replaced at all. Robert Early never spoke publicly about his wartime service in detail. The brief interview he gave in 1992 was arranged by a local historical society documenting veterans' experiences, and even then, he was reluctant to discuss specifics. When pressed about the long-range Tiger kill, he consistently deflected credit. "The Tiger crew made mistakes," he said. "They stopped in the open. They weren't watching their flank. They probably thought they were safe at that range. I just took advantage of their mistake. If they'd been buttoned up and moving, I'd never have hit them." This assessment was characteristically modest, but also tactically astute. The Tiger crew had indeed made errors, stopping in the open, presenting a broadside, failing to maintain all-around security. But their errors were understandable. At 1,800 yards, they had every reason to believe they were outside the effective range of Sherman guns. Their tactical assumptions were based on sound understanding of ballistic performance. They were simply unlucky that every variable aligned against them at that particular moment. Early's reluctance to claim credit also reflected something deeper: survivor's guilt that haunted many veterans. He'd survived the war while friends and crew members from earlier tanks had not. He'd achieved a remarkable feat, while others who'd attempted similar shots had failed and died trying. The randomness of who lived and who died in combat was something many veterans struggled to process. In his final years, Early developed dementia and spent time in a veterans' care facility. Staff noted that he sometimes became agitated in the afternoons, speaking about needing to get back to his tank, worrying about his crew. The war, 60 years past, remained vivid in ways that recent memories were not. He died in 2008, age 85, one of the last surviving veterans of 3rd Armored Division's drive across Europe. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in a single line: "Robert served in the U.S. Army during World War II." No mention of the impossible shot, the Tiger kill, the Bronze Star recommendation that became a commendation. His family held a quiet funeral, and he was buried in a veterans' cemetery outside Madison with full military honors. The 76mm Sherman he'd crewed in April 1945 was scrapped in 1946, its armor cut up and recycled. No record exists of its serial number or final disposition. It was one tank among thousands, notable only for a single extraordinary moment when everything aligned and the impossible became real. The mathematical improbability of Early's shot deserves final consideration. Assuming the Tiger's side armor at the point of impact was 82 millimeters thick, and assuming the M62 round arrived at approximately 1,780 feet per second, and assuming the impact angle was within 20 degrees of perpendicular, and assuming the armor quality was average or below, the probability of penetration can be estimated. British and American penetration testing from the period suggests that at this velocity, against this thickness, penetration probability was approximately 15 to 25% under ideal test conditions. Combat conditions, uncertain range estimation, atmospheric effects, manufacturing variations, target movement would reduce this probability substantially. A conservative estimate for combat conditions might place penetration probability at 10% or lower. But penetration alone doesn't account for the catastrophic kill. The round had to penetrate, and then strike something vital inside the fighting compartment: ammunition, fuel, crew. The internal layout of the Tiger placed ammunition storage along the hull sides, making a side penetration likely to hit ammunition. Estimating the probability of hitting ammunition storage after penetration is speculative, but perhaps 30 to 50% seems reasonable. Combining these probabilities, 10% chance of penetration, 40% chance of hitting ammunition if penetration occurs, suggests an overall probability of catastrophic kill of approximately 4%, 1 chance in 25. These are rough estimates based on incomplete data, but they provide order of magnitude understanding. Early's shot wasn't impossible in the strict sense. There was a non-zero probability of success, but it was so improbable that attempting it represented a calculated gamble with poor odds. The fact that he succeeded once, then failed at better range with his second shot, perfectly illustrates the chaotic nature of combat. Probability predicts aggregate outcomes across many trials, but individual trials are binary. The coin lands heads or tails regardless of the odds. Modern military planning accounts for this through emphasis on overwhelming superiority. Rather than accept 4% success probability, modern doctrine seeks to create conditions where success probability exceeds 90%. This is achieved through better weapons, better sensors, better training, and better tactics. The goal is to eliminate the role of luck, to make outcomes predictable and favorable. But luck can never be entirely eliminated from combat. Unexpected variables always emerge. Equipment malfunctions, intelligence proves wrong, weather changes, human error occurs. The difference between modern warfare and Early's experience is that modern systems have redundancy and backup plans that make individual lucky shots less necessary. Early didn't have backup plans. He had one tank, one gun, and one shot at stopping Tigers that were threatening infantry positions. The shot was improbable, but it was the only option available. That it succeeded was luck. That he took the shot despite poor odds was courage. The broader historical significance of the 76mm gun lies not in spectacular individual achievements, but in aggregate effect. Across all theaters and all engagements from July 1944 through May 1945, 76mm Shermans engaged German armor thousands of times. Most engagements resulted in inconclusive outcomes. Shots exchanged, positions abandoned, targets missed. Some resulted in Sherman losses, crews killed, tanks destroyed. Some resulted in German losses, Panthers knocked out from flank shots, Panzer IVs penetrated at moderate range, Tigers destroyed by lucky hits. The cumulative effect of thousands of engagements was steady attrition of German armor that couldn't be replaced. Even when 76mm guns failed to penetrate, they forced German tanks to withdraw, consume ammunition, expend fuel, and remain exposed to artillery and air attack. Even unsuccessful engagements contributed to German logistical exhaustion. This is the unglamorous reality of industrial warfare. Spectacular individual achievements like Early's matter for morale and make good stories, but they don't determine strategic outcomes. Strategic outcomes emerge from the accumulation of thousands of small actions, most of them mundane, that collectively exhaust the enemy's capacity to continue fighting. The 76mm gun contributed to this exhaustion. It wasn't the decisive weapon. No single weapon system was decisive in World War II, but it was one component of the larger system that ground down German military power through relentless pressure across all domains. American armor doctrine understood this. The goal was never to win individual tank versus tank duels through superior technology. The goal was to maintain continuous offensive pressure using adequate equipment available in overwhelming quantities. The 76mm gun was adequate. The quantities were overwhelming. The pressure was continuous. Germany, facing this pressure while simultaneously fighting the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, couldn't sustain the multi-front attrition. Each Tiger destroyed, whether by lucky Sherman shot or methodical tank destroyer engagement, represented irreplaceable combat power. By April 1945, German armored forces had been ground down to isolated remnants, operating without fuel, ammunition, or hope. The 76mm gun didn't win the war, but it contributed to winning the war, and that was all it needed to do. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.